Hey class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are looking at chapter 6, the topic of the self. This will be expanding upon a topic you probably heard about in intro psych. Especially I think when we talk about personality theory, this subject comes up a lot, but this will be an expansion upon that. And so we'll start with looking at the self concept. So you should be able to identify some key aspects of the self concept, cite two types of self discrepancies and describe their effects and ways to cope with them, discuss important factors that help form the self concept, and explain how individual and collectivist cultures influence the self concept. So really, when we talk about self-concept, we are talking about an organized collections of beliefs about the self. Like, what do you believe about yourself? Like, how do you view yourself? The self oftentimes is this idea, like, if you ask certain questions like, who am I? What am I good at? What do I want to be? You're starting to touch upon those ideas of the self. Your responses to questions, those bigger questions are, in a sense, your sense of self. And those beliefs we have are self schemas. They're ways in which we see the world, through the lens of the self. They influence things like our personality, our abilities, physical features, values, goals, social roles, things like that. Those are all things that we use to kind of how we see the world in terms of self. But in psychology, we aren't just referring to like a singular self. A lot of times, there's the self you are now, but there's also this idea of possible selves, like somebody you could be in the future, depending on how things work out. Like, if you're watching this video, you're probably a college student and you probably have some kind of possible self in mind. Like, maybe there's a job you want to do, or maybe there's, something you're trying to do to better yourself. And taking this course and watching this video right now is kind of a way to do that. So self-concept can look different. Like, for example, Jason versus Chris in this example. Like, Jason considers himself tall, athletic, friendly, masculine. He's a son. He's, maybe liberal, versus Chris, who considered himself average looking, energetic, intelligent, conservative, whatever. All of those kind of adjectives we might use to describe ourselves would fit under that kind of bubble of our self-concept. And so, this is, where does this come from? Where does the nature of it come from? We have self-perceptions. We develop self-perceptions throughout, time, over time, as we age and grow and learn. We have our actual self. So maybe the person we are right now, the ideal self, who we would like to be, and the ought self, maybe things, you think you should possess, qualities like, I should be a good friend. Whether or not I am a good friend or not, that's for somebody to say, but I know, like, that's something I should be. For example, there are also self discrepancies where there are mismatches between, for example, our actual, our ideal, and our ought selves, when there's incongruity between those. And this is, kind of when we start to see that kind of incongruity, that's where, we start to see maybe the development of, things like anxiety, worry, and stuff like that. So when we have our actual self, when it falls short of the ideal self, we feel emotions like dejection and being sad. When the actual self falls short of our ought self, we might experience emotions like irritability, guilt, things like that. So we're experiencing some sort of negative emotions when there's a gap between ourselves. And so, you can kind of see this, for example, if there's a gap between your actual self and ideal self, we can kind of see how this can lead to depression, for example, actual self and ought self, perhaps even leading to anxiety. But, we'll talk about those ideas later on in a future chapter. But people will cope when there's different ways to cope when there are discrepancies. One thing you can do is to change, you can change your behavior. If you're a person who values health, for example, but your actual self smokes cigarettes, maybe there are things that you can do to get closer to that ought self. Like, you realize, hey, if I'm someone who values health, but I still smoke, I probably need to change that. I need to figure out a way to change that. Also, being more blunt about self-awareness. Avoiding situations that could increase your self-awareness, or perhaps imbibing in alcohol. This is a kind of a way of like avoiding the problem. You're coping it with it by avoiding it altogether. So self-awareness, it's interesting though, what what alcohol can do in terms of our level of self-awareness. People who have high self-awareness compared to low self-awareness tend to react more to failure feedback than success. But we look at low self-awareness, the opposite is true. So alcohol does have an effect on our self-awareness, but there are some mediating or moderating effects depending on whether you have, high or low self-awareness. What are some factors that influence our self-concept? Well, we compare ourselves to others, and Festinger, for example, almost 70 years ago, has been talking about this through self-compare or social comparison theory, which we use other people as a reference point or a reference group as a way to kind of assess our own abilities and realize, oh, I need to improve upon this. Or, if you're in a friend group and you see all of your friends are more generous and are more, maybe, with their time and money, maybe that kind of leads you to think, oh, maybe I should be, if I'm in this group, I need to be more generous with my time and money and be more helpful. So it's a reference group. It's a point of reference that we can make to either improve our behavior, or we can use it to bolt. So we can improve sort of an upward social comparison, or we can look maybe down. I know this doesn't sound good, but in order to boost our self-esteem, we might look at somebody who is maybe we might consider inferior in some way or another and say, oh, well, at least I'm not this person. So social comparison can kind of work both ways. Obviously, these observations we make about our own behavior in relation to others are very subjective and are distorted. So we have to be, pretty honest with ourselves. We see ourselves differently, perhaps, than other people see ourselves. Like if this was a couple here, these two people here, they probably see themselves much more positively than perhaps they are, being perceived, perceived by their partner. So other factors that shape our self-concept, the feedback we get from others, it's not just from observing others, but what they tell us as well, balancing feedback from others with our observations. Those start pretty early on with family members. Parents, for example, tend to be our primary influences as far as self-concept. But as we get older, we're in school, teachers, coaches, friends start to become more important. Later in life, you kind of narrow that back down again. It's much more about, your closer friends, your partner, husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, people like that tend to take a larger role in influencing your self-concept. Social factors also matter. We might, depending on certain social situations, we might be more or less critical when we're evaluating our own self-concept. Our culture matters too, growing up in an individualistic versus a collectivist culture. We can even see that kind of reflected, if an individualistic culture, the I is much more at the center of kind of goals, personal goals over group goals, but that's the opposite. When we talk about collectivist cultures, collectivist groups, those tend to be putting the group ahead of the individual. So people who are in an individualistic culture, they tend to have a more independent view of themselves. They tend to view themselves as much more unique and distinct from others, as opposed to a collectivist culture. You're have a much more interdependent view of yourself and as much more connected to others. And that's kind of reflected in this bubble, diagram here. The self in a independent, individualistic system is going to be at the center of things. And, kind of it's almost like you're the sun and everything else is revolving around you. Whereas you can see there's much more overlap from a collectivist way of thinking. Your sense of self is very much ingrained or overlap with the sense of self of all these other people in your life. Okay, now we'll talk about self-esteem or self-worth. Depending on your textbook, you might see it as self-worth or self-esteem. So we're going to clarify, by the end of this section, you should be able to clarify the implications of self-concept, confusion, and self-esteem instability. Explain how high and low self-esteem are related to adjustment, distinguish between high self-esteem and narcissism, discuss narcissism and aggression, discuss some key influences in the development of self-esteem or self-worth. So self-esteem is really just your overall assessment of your worth as an individual. Like, do you view yourself positively? Do you view yourself negatively? It's a very global evaluation of many different aspects of yourself. Are you a good student? Are you a good friend, a good father, all of those things. And it can be looked at in a couple different ways. We might look at it in terms of traits. kind of this enduring sense of confidence in a person, or more of a state, that feeling that might change depending on the situation. So maybe overall, an individual might have high self-esteem, but maybe depending on certain circumstances, that self-esteem might look different. For example, like I have pretty high self-esteem now in being able to play the sport of rugby now that I have a year of playing under my belt. But if you stuck me in a whole nother sport like water polo or something like that, my self-esteem, that state at that time might be somewhat low because I don't really have any idea what's going on. I'm put into a new situation. So your self-esteem is, it is built, or it evolves around a number of things. It could be your self-image socially, your emotional self-image, your academic self-image, physical, and this can be reflected in all these various relationships, in areas of your life, for example. So self-esteem is kind of this broad topic, and there are a lot of different self-images that fall under. And for example, you might have high self-esteem when it comes to your social image, but maybe not so much your academic image. So, you have to be, we want to be more nuanced in understanding the various aspects of self-esteem. And if you want to know about your self-esteem, you can take this 10-item assessment of the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, and you can actually calculate your score. The higher your score, the higher the self-esteem. So if you want, this is in your textbook, or you can pause the video right now and complete this for yourself. So for the sake of time, though, I am going to move on. So why is self-esteem? It's important. It is very important for adjustment. It is a consistent predictor or connection to happiness. Like people who have a higher sense of self-esteem or self-worth tend to be happier than people who do not. People with high self-esteem also tend to be more likable. They tend to be more attractive. They have more meaningful relations. They make better first impressions, better overall impressions. They tend to persist longer in the face of failure. However, we don't necessarily see a connection between achievement and self-esteem, because obviously you could think about like having a high sense of self-esteem doesn't necessarily guarantee you that you will achieve. Like just because I have a high sense of self-esteem in math doesn't necessarily mean every math class I'm going to take, I'm going to get an A. There could be other factors at play as well. High self-esteem, we want to make sure there is a difference between high self-esteem, feeling good about yourself, versus being narcissistic. Narcissistic is when we're starting to see things like feeling too good about yourself, and that is perhaps an undesirable characteristic. Narcissism is the tendency to regard yourself very much from a point of grandiosity, like you think you're better or more important than you actually in fact are. It can be pathological, and it's very much different than high self-esteem, which is a very normal, healthy trait to have. Narcissistic individuals tend to be preoccupied with fantasies of success, their own success. They believe that they deserve better treatment, and typically they react pretty aggressively if they feel threatened, if that sense of ego or pride is threatened. So there are different kinds of, someone who scores high on narcissism, they have a negative evaluation. They might perceive that as a threat, leading to aggression. An individual with low narcissism probably not going to perceive it as a threat and low aggression. Other factors that influence self-esteem, your parents are one of the first agents of socialization, especially when it comes to self-worth. They play a very important role early on. Their acceptance of their children and the level of control they exhibit towards their children oftentimes has a pretty powerful influence on the self-worth. Ideally, authoritative parenting is associated with the highest self-esteem outcomes in terms of like self-reporting. Authoritative parents, high acceptance of their children, but also are very involved in their children's life. Like it says high control. That doesn't mean like they control every aspect of their kid's life, but it just means they're very involved. Compared to authoritarians, very low acceptance of their children, but very much involved. Neglectful children, the opposite. They're low in terms of acceptance and control. Permissive, more like their children's friend. They're more like my way, or they're like, their best friend as opposed to being their parent. Ethnicity, we do see differences in ethnicity and self-esteem, for example, and gender. White males tend to have higher self-esteem than white females, but minority males have lower self-esteem than minority females. So there tends to be this kind of interesting dynamic when it comes to gender and also race, ethnicity. Overall, men tend to score higher on self-esteem than females. White females have lower self-esteem. But we need to be really careful. These are not causal relationships in the sense that, like, okay, if you're a white male, that causes you to have high self-esteem. If you're a white male, you most likely live in a world that is very conducive for your white maleness, and you don't have as many impediments to your self-esteem versus, like, let's say if you're like a Black female, or, you know, for example, or a Latina, you know, if you're Latinx and you're female or male or whatever, any other race, ethnicity, or gender, you know, you have less impediments in your way. So we need to be very careful how we interpret this kind of data. Okay, self-perception. How do we perceive ourselves? You know, how do we perceive others? You know, so distinguishing between automatic and controlled processing when it comes to forming self-perceptions, being able to define self-attributions and identify key dimensions of attributions, explain how optimistic and pessimistic explanatory styles are related to adjustment. We'll look at the motives that guide our self-understanding, and then 4 methods for self-enhancement. So cognition plays a large role in self-perception. It is what allows us to kind of maintain our view of our sense of self. And we have kind of 2 different processes for you know, organizing perceptual or self-perception information. We have automatic processing, very much the default mode. It's, you know, this is stuff we do without having to put a lot of thought or effort into it. Like when you wake up and you start going into your morning routine, brushing your teeth, taking a shower, things like that, you're on autopilot. You don't have to make a lot of decisions at that point. You're really not even trying to. Versus the controlled processing method, which is very active, very engaged in the decision-making process and analysis. And, you know, through these different kinds of processes, we are forming attributions about ourselves, like making inferences about our own behavior. We can make either internal or external attributions. An internal attribution is when we ascribe the cause of our behavior to something internal, like I did really well on my exam yesterday because I'm smart. External attribution is looking at something situational or external to ourselves. So, oh, I didn't do as well in the test yesterday because the professor made it too hard, you know, something outside of myself. You know, when we make these kind of attributions about ourselves, you know, internal tends to be more focused on personality, you know, like things like age, gender, skills, ethnicity, education, things like that. External might be the setting, other people, rules, weather, time of day. So things that are, you know, outside of us, external to us. We also look at whether or not the situation is stable or unstable. You know, some attributions are going to be stable, meaning they are unlikely to change over time. Like, for example, your personality. If you're an extrovert now, that's going to be pretty stable throughout your lifetime. Unstable attributions, though, like effort, you know, that might vary. You know, some days you can give a lot of effort, other days maybe not so much, because you have, you know, maybe your energy varies, your motivation varies. So, you know, we can look at things like, you know, the internal, external causes on the same dimension, you know, a 4x4 matrix, or 2x2, sorry, of stability as well. So if it's an internal unstable cause, like your effort, your mood, or whether or not you're tired, you're fatigued. If it's internal and a stable cause, maybe your ability, your intelligence, which actually intelligence is, we do know actually it's subject to change after all, so that might not be the best example there. External and unstable, luck, chance, opportunities are what we might use to attribute, trying to explain ourselves. If it's a stable external cause, it might be something like the test difficulty, for example. We really also look at things, how much control do we exert? You know, do we have an internal, do we have an external locus of control? Is this even controllable or not? Whether or not we have any kind of outside control or effort. And ultimately, these kind of get into our explanatory style. So what kind of causal attributions do we tend to make in a wide variety of situations? You know, we might have a kind of a fallback explanatory approach. Some people fall more into more of an optimistic approach, looking at things that are more setbacks as something that's external, unstable, and specific. So like, hey, this sucked this time, but guess what? I can do better the next time. Sometimes people will adopt the opposite, a pessimistic approach, which is when I have a setback, it's internal, it's stable, it's global, it's going to be hard to change. So might need to do something else instead. So let's take an event like if you fail an exam, like if you, let's say, unfortunately, you fail an exam in one of your classes, you can adopt an optimistic or a pessimistic. Well, an optimistic approach might say, well, I failed the exam because I had a lot more work or pressure at work prevented me from studying. Therefore, maybe the next time I think I'll have more time to study. This was kind of a one-off thing. So I think I'll do better in the future. And this leads to more positive emotions. Like maybe you have temporary negative emotions, but those will disappear eventually, versus a pessimistic explanatory style. I failed the exam because I'm just not smart enough. I'm stupid. I'm dumb, whatever label you want to use. And you have lack of control. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm never going to get through this kind of course. And it might lead to feelings of depression or even learned helplessness. So, why do we engage? What is the motivation behind self-understanding? One, gives us a self-assessment, like truthful information about ourselves, or we might use it for self-enhancement to kind of maintain certain positive feelings about ourselves. We might use a form of self-comparison, for example. Ways we might do that, enhancing ourselves, downward social comparison, like looking at people who might have it worse than you and saying, oh, it could be a lot worse. Self-serving bias, only looking for information that verifies, your world beliefs. Basking in reflected glory, like looking back on the past. Self-handicapping, like making, doing worse on purpose to kind of build in excuses for failure. So how do we regulate the self? That's also important too. So you should be able to define self-regulation, especially ego depletion model, explain self-efficacy and why it's important for adjustment, and describe the 3 factors or categories of self-defeating behaviors. So self-regulation is the process of directing or controlling your behavior. Like it's really important. There are times when you have to control yourself, like when you go out to eat, maybe you're really hungry, but you have to wait for the waiter to bring you the food. You can't just start like grabbing food off of people's plates around you, you're probably going to get kicked out of the restaurant. So the idea is that, we can regulate our behavior to an extent, but the ego depletion model says we have a finite resource for being able to regulate our behavior. We can resist temptation for so long. Maybe you can do it today, but it might be more difficult tomorrow. Those resources are finite. We also want to think about self-efficacy. It's our belief in our ability to do something in a given situation. So you might have self-efficacy whether or not you can regulate your own behavior. So, and we see it is situationally specific. And the better your self-efficacy it is, we tend to see healthy adjustment. So if you have self-efficacy, for example, to resist the urge to, smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol or in excess or eat foods in excess, for example, we might see some pretty positive, healthy adjustment in life. Self-efficacy can be learned and it can be changed. It's a skill that we can learn. And it's very important in terms of mental and physical health. Being able to believe that you can make positive changes in your life is absolutely critical for success in life. We develop self-efficacy through mastery experiences, like seeing ourselves being successful, but we can also experience those vicariously, like watching somebody else succeed. We develop self-efficacy through persuasion, through encouragement, and also our own emotional arousal, our own emotional interpretation. If we try something new, we're nervous, we might interpret that one way, but we want to make sure, hey, we can attribute that arousal to like, hey, that's normal. It's not necessarily fear. That's normal to try new things and get nervous about them. That's very much a normal way to react. Thinking about the self, we also want to be mindful of self-defeating behaviors, any action that might kind of thwart or avert our own personal success or personal interests. Sometimes this might be deliberate self-destruction, like preparing for an exam. You just don't study. You're like, I'm nervous about this test. I'm just not even going to study because why even study? I'm going to fail anyways. Trading off engaging in short-term harmful behaviors in order to pursue healthy long-term goals, counterproductive strategies, persisting ineffective strategies to achieve a goal. It's kind of like that saying, insanity is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting, different results. Self-presentation, how we present ourselves to others. So define impression management and Psych strategies people use to make positive impressions. Understand how high self monitors are different from low self monitors. Public self is the image that we present to others. Like the moment you leave the house, or it doesn't have to be the house, like whatever you post on social media, for example, also is a public self. Your public self can vary depending on time, place, and context. So oftentimes we have multiple selves. Like you might have a public self on your Instagram page that is very different from the public self that you exhibit when you leave your house. Ideally, adjustment is best when there is a lot of overlap, like when we don't see incongruency, when we have a lot of overlap between these multiple selves. So for example, person A, there is some overlap, but maybe not quite as much as person two. So we would see probably a healthier amount of adjustment from person two. How do we manage our impressions that we make to others? Our conscious effort to influence others, for example, or how they think of us. There's ingratiation, making ourselves likable to others, so giving compliments, self-promotion, really singing your own praises to other people, supplication, maybe acting weak towards another person, negative acknowledgement, admitting your own flaws, kind of, eating humble pie, for example. Sometimes that will form a positive self-impersonation or impression. Sorry, not impersonation. I said the wrong word. It's also important that we understand self-monitoring. How much are we able to attend and control the impressions we make with others? Some people tend to be high in their self-monitoring. They're very concerned about making favorable impressions versus people who are low in self-monitoring. They're more likely to express their true feelings or attitudes. And we tend to see more adjustment in terms of low self-monitoring. So last kind of topic is ways that we can build self-esteem. So list 8 ways to build self-esteem. Building self-esteem is important because we know people who have lower self-esteem tend to be less happy in life. They're more prone to depression. They're more demoralized, set back by failure. They tend to be more anxious in their relationships. So here are, generally speaking, kind of 8 guidelines of ways that you can enhance or build self-esteem. One, recognize that you control your self-image. Like you can change your self-image to a more positive one. You can take active steps to present a more public self-image, a more positive self-image. You can take steps to learn more about yourself. Knowledge of self is so important. You can, let others, you can set your goals for yourself. Don't let somebody else do it for you. When you have goals, be aware of the ones that are realistic versus the ones that are not. Modify self-talk, try to replace that self-talk, adopt more of an optimistic explanatory style. Be more aware of your strengths. Focus on your strengths, focus on the things that you're good at or the things that you do well versus the things you lack or don't do well. Try to cultivate new strengths, maybe use your current strengths to base off of it and create new ones. And then try to approach others, the people around you, with a more positive outlook. Be like Taylor Swift. I'm 100%, wait a minute, I'm 99% sure that's Taylor Swift. I'm going to feel so bad if it's not. Whereas individuals with low self-esteem, they tend to be more overly sensitive to rejection, which feeds into the actual rejection by others, leads to more hurtful, negative behaviors when they're relating to people. So that kind of negative self-esteem feedback loop kind of, feeds into itself. So that's going to be it for chapter number 6. We're almost halfway through the course by now. So we'll be back for chapter 7. Let me know if you have any questions, drop them in the chat, or drop them in the comment box, or drop them on Canvas, probably where you're watching this from. So I'll see you all next time. Peace.